This episode of The Energy Show is proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.
So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OBBB, is now law in the United States. And that bill eliminates the 30% tax credit for residential solar. And it adds restrictions to the 30% tax credit for commercial solar. And you got to remember, even though it's a commercial structure, that commercial structure is used for residential leases and power purchase agreements, or PPAs, because those are considered commercial installations, and those installations also get bonus depreciation. So effectively, the price for cash and loan purchases of solar is going to go up 30% on January 1st, 2026. Solar leasing's more complicated. Effectively, there will be changes in the leasing prices or the PPA prices. That'll have to be seen as far as how that rolls out. And the other thing that's some uncertainty is the domestic content rules, the safe harbor considerations, and this thing called foreign entity of concern, or FEOC issues, are going to complicate product availability and pricing and financing. We just don't know what those rules are yet, so it's a little crazy. So every solar contractor is working like crazy to get systems installed by December 31st, 2025. And ironically, it's not even clear what the definition of installed and completed is right now, so I'm not going to get into those details because they'll change. But I think 2025 is going to be a record year for solar and battery installations in the U.S. because of the end of this tax credit. So the smart companies right now are planning for 2026. And, you know, when I kind of look at it, we're involved in the industry too. We're an installer. There's two big questions that we have and that I'm trying to get answered by industry leaders. What should solar contractors do to succeed in 2026 and beyond? And also, what should solar and battery customers, homeowners, consider when evaluating products and installers? So I'm setting up a series of these podcasts, and I'm honored to have several experts in the value chain of solar, battery, racking, things like that, to provide advice and insights based on their decades of experience. And this week's guest is Jeff Spies, and he's a true solar pioneer going back almost 20 years. He's the president of Planet Plansets. He's been a CALSA, California Solar and Storage Association, board member for many years. He's a secretary. He keeps us honest. He remembers what the minutes are. And he's the smartest, by far and away, codes and standards guy that I know, and that codes and standards are really important. He's also the executive producer of a movie called Solar Roots, which documents the early days of the solar industry. You know, I kind of looking at a picture of Jeff here, and I'm looking at the background. He literally has electricity running through his veins instead of blood. So welcome to the show, Jeff.
It's an honor to be here, Barry, and obviously, you know, I have a high degree of respect for all the work and contributions you've made over the years to the industry. So I want to thank you also for the work you do with CALSA and just to help keep the industry moving forward. And, you know, your energy show, I think, is one of the most reputable sources of quality information in our industry today.
Well, back at you. You know, you're doing a great job at Planet Plansets. But tell us a little bit about Planet Plansets and the services you provide to the solar industry.
Sure. We generate permitting plan sets, or just plan sets, for solar and storage projects, although we get involved in EV chargers and a variety of other ancillary related equipment, as well as doing the interconnection application processing, which is getting more and more complicated as solar and storage gets more involved. So we have that full range of services of plan drafting and interconnection application processing, and I guess to a certain degree, the supporting services that are kind of provided as part of that process of plan set generation and interconnection application is we provide technical help to customers that are trying to wrap their head around the complexities and the products and the performance and configurations and safety considerations. So we like to look at ourselves as the partner in the design process to the contractor, to those professional engineers that might be involved, to make certain that they're getting the benefit of all the technical knowledge that we gain in our day-to-day activities relevant to codes and standards development, dissemination, and training.
And how can people get in touch with Planet Plansets if they're interested in getting solar and battery plans?
Well, our website is our name, planetplansets.com. And I'll just tell a quick story. When we founded the company, I was with my two business partners hiking in just an absolutely beautiful canyon east of Phoenix in the Superstition Mountains called Fish Creek Canyon, which got really badly damaged by horrible fire a few years back. And we're hiking, we're back in this canyon, and it's got bighorn sheep and just amazing. It's not, you wouldn't think this is Arizona. It's just lush. It's like a tropical paradise down in this crack in the earth. And so we were talking about this business, trying to figure out a name for the company. And we said, it'd probably be good to have the name of your product in your company. That's where Plansets came from. And then we were trying to figure out what would go along with the words Plansets. And, Planet hit. And I was like, Planet Plansets. That has a good ring to it. And here all these years later, I just am super pleased that we chose that name because we like to think that we're providing these plan sets for the good of the planet. And we want to obviously give tremendous value to our clients and make sure that they do it right so that the systems give the best long-term performance and value. I look at the long-term cost of ownership as to what customers really care about. Oftentimes they say that we want the lowest price, but what they really mean is we want the lowest cost over the system life, and that's how we work with our clients.
Yeah, so higher quality results in more savings. That totally makes sense. All right, so let's dive right in. And as I mentioned, we're going to be covering two big questions. What should solar contractors do to succeed in 2026 and beyond? And what should solar and battery customers consider when evaluating products and installers? So let's start off with that first big question. And I know there's lots of elements to it. What should contractors be doing now to succeed long term?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the forecast for next year is a little bit hard to understand, other than we anticipate it'll be down notably. And the way that I'm looking at it, based upon the analysis we've done for the past couple months, now that we've realized that Section 25D is not viable, is what can we do to sustain the drop in business that will drop hard in first quarter, and then it will start to increase at some rate sometime down the road. How many months does that low water mark last? And then what is the recovery rate? So what our goal is to keep as many of our staff members, ideally all of them, because the only value we as a company have are the smart people that work for us, and try to minimize our cash burn over the next year to survive to that point when the industry starts to grow. Because the thing I will say that will give some folks hope is, despite the fact that we are losing a really important tax credit on the 25D side at least, the fact is that solar and energy storage are still the cheapest kilowatt hours that the grid can add, and we're the quickest to deploy. The next most rapid to deploy opportunity in the industry would be gas, but gas turbines have a 3 to 5 year, or in some cases 7-year backlog. So I think that with the projections we hear reliably because of AI and all the other electrification happening in society today, that we will need more electricity. And while unfortunately the federal government is destabilizing the industry in the short term, we still have the lowest cost electricity. So I think we will get back on a growth track as time goes on. We're just trying to figure out how we manage our cash burn rate in the early part of next year to be able to recover in a healthy way as the year goes on. That said, I think most contractors, plain and simple, are going to have to scale back operations. They're going to have to, unfortunately, let installer, if you have 5 crews, well, you ain't going to have 5 crews worth of business first quarter next year. I'd say that's a pretty reliable prediction. And what can you do to keep your good staff? And unfortunately, how do you address those staff that you can't financially support? That's the difficult business decision that so many business owners are going to be faced with here in the coming months. And what do you do to prepare when the industry does recover? So I don't have all the answers at this time. I just know that those are the considerations we have to take into account.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you about the trend line of what's going to happen with the industry. And our utility friends are continuing to raise pricing. So that's going to help. And then I also expect that we're going to see some cost reductions throughout the value chain. And that's also going to help to eliminate that 30% price increase effectively that's happening January 1st.
This is an interesting point I want to ask you about, Barry, because we do have anticipations. I'm seeing articles over and over throughout the industry and beyond that electric rates are going to go up notably. What is your sense in California, at least with the big three utilities, of how much more rate increase we might see here in the next couple of years?
I mean, we have analyzed the Energy Information Administration data going back 20 years. And if you look at the rate of the average electric rate increase for homeowners in PG&E territory, that's where we're just kind of focusing on PG&E, it's been 8 to 10% over the last 7 or 8 years. I see that continuing. Now, the utilities are really smart. They're trying to figure out how to wave their arms around. They're looking at increasing fixed charges. So they may be able to sneak in through the PUC, increasing fixed charges immensely, and then not increasing the incremental charges. So we'll see how that goes. But, that's just going to be the reason why the organizations such as SEIA and CalSA have to continue to fight. I want to focus a little bit more on how does your business, how does Planet Plansets help contractors overcome that loss of the 30% tax credit? How can you improve the contractor's efficiency and profitability?
Well, I guess the one way we can help is that as contractor companies have to downsize, they may find that that person who managed their Planset generation internally no longer works for them, or might have to be reallocated to different tasks because of the changing nature of the business. So, there are companies we've already had approach us that are either recognizing that next year they can't have their own in-house design team, or that they will, losing their designers that they already have. I think there's a lot of instability in the Planset generations sector. So I think that we can be a helpful outlet valve for a lot of contractors that don't necessarily have the financial resources and volume to justify full-time in-house design and interconnection applications. So that's one possible way that we can assist in this upcoming change. The question is, how much can we reduce our costs to stay viable? That's an interesting one, because we've seen certainly products have gotten less expensive. Look at modules over the past 15 years and the price reductions that we've seen there. But I don't think anybody's anticipating that we're going to see module prices decline notably, where we're going to see major cost savings. Racking is kind of in that same ball camp. There might be some new innovative racking solutions that could help reduce the cost per watt of racking, but how much really can we achieve there? Now, the big cost contributors nowadays, hardware-wise, to solar storage are the inverter and battery system. And we have seen some notably less expensive products come to market in the last couple of years. I think that we want to give a word of caution to folks. And I always have believed that you get what you pay for. And if a product is less expensive, there's a reason. Sometimes it's because the company is being very aggressive with pricing to capture market share. Sometimes it's because the cost of that product's less. And that doesn't always make it a bad thing. It just means that you need to be conscientious that there's a difference in price, often for a reason, and try to understand what those compromises might be when you find something that's less expensive. So hardware costs, can those come down? To a degree, I agree they will come down. But where else might there be cost savings potential? Well, I think the big one is sales costs. And it's incredible, Barry, again, not being an expert in this area of third-party ownership, when I hear some of the costs of getting projects sold in the third-party ownership realm, that seems hard for me to wrap my head around. So the interesting thing is that we see folks that can today, for contractor installed systems for commercial businesses in California, as long as they own the building that they're operating their business in and they are operating during daylight hours, you can see a contractor installed system with a 5-year payback, totally legit. The thing is, that's the Goldilocks customer. It owns the building they work in and they're using power. As long as you can offset that power during the day, you can theoretically make solar pencil very attractively. But, I realize that we're just plain and simple, what can people do to reduce their soft costs? Well, I think reducing the cost of bringing in new customers. And my sense is that their market is starting to get primed for that, because up until now, a lot of people didn't know a lot about solar, but now enough of their friends and relatives have it that you don't necessarily have to convince them that solar works. You might have to explain to them how the finances work. And that, to me, is the most important thing that I can recommend to contractors that want to continue to sell systems to homeowners that aren't able to take advantage of the commercial tax credits, which is, if you can present to them the honest, understandable value that investing in solar and a battery system brings to that specific customer, then I think you have viability going forward. So, keep in mind, the way I like to say it, I've seen legitimate projections that show somewhere between 8 to 10 year payback on contractor installed solar and storage systems. And you might say, well, 8 to 10 years, that isn't as good as 5 to 7 years as it used to be. Well, what if you were to say it this way? You can have your savings pay for a backup battery in about 10 years. I think it reframes the conversation to say, this is something that brings value that a grid tie only system can't bring. Grid tie only often was looked at for, I'm getting so much savings on my investment. And that's great. But what if you were to reposition that and say, you can get savings that pays for a backup battery system, so when the grid goes down, you can operate your home-based business. You can have a window air conditioner unit so you can sleep at night. You can keep your refrigerator running, your lights and your outlets, and your garage door opener, which could be literally a matter of life and death. We saw that in Paradise, California, where people couldn't operate their garage door, couldn't get out, so they couldn't escape the fire. So there are, I think, ways that contractors can learn how to present the value potential of solar and storage that has tremendous impact. I think the dilemma is that to date, most salespeople in our industry are pretty immune to the technology and don't understand how it works.
Yeah, you're talking about selling value, talking about an honest value of that battery. It's an emotional thing. It's a safety thing. The way that most of the sales in the U.S. are done are through third-party ownership systems. And you have very aggressive salespeople. Some people refer to them as solar bros. And the solar bros can sell the system for whatever price they can get, as long as it's over what's called a red line. So there may be a $3 red line for solar and a $4 red line for solar and a battery. And if they can sell it for $6 or $7, they can make a ton of money. Now, customer's not going to get a good deal, but those costs are high. I think some of that's going to go away. There's just going to be general price pressure. And I think some ethics are going to return to the industry, but customer acquisition costs are high. We have really high customer acquisition costs here too, but we're in the lower price range. We're not like, crazy numbers, but we're also premium because we're selling value. We're going to be here. And homeowners to whom we're selling understand that long-term support, using quality equipment, expertise, salespeople really know what they're doing. That really, really makes a big difference.
Now, there's one additional element that can help address this concept of quote-unquote soft costs. That's everything other than, I guess, the hardware that you're buying, which is the process of permitting and interconnection is unnecessarily complicated in some respects, and in other respects, there's an appropriate level of complication that's inevitable when systems get more involved, such as solar and storage. Solar only was fairly straightforward. Energy storage has introduced a whole host of variables that you must and should consider for safety and performance. So I do feel that, unfortunately, today we have the statistics that I like to quote to people are 30,000 authorities have in jurisdiction. About 18,000 of those would be building departments that would issue permits. You have 3,000 utilities in the U.S., and every jurisdiction, every utility has their own, sometimes subtle, different ways that they do things. And those differences really pose a complex challenge to contractors that are trying to understand the utility rules and regulations, which often have little oversight from state public utilities commissions. And then you also have to understand the local jurisdiction, the building department, to understand that, what their safety requirements will be. So my sense is that the work that's being done at CALSA and SIA to help clarify the codes and standards and ideally try to get more consistency are going to be important long-term to reducing these quote-unquote soft costs. I will say that I don't think that solar and storage lends itself to be a cookie-cutter solution the way that solar only could at times. I think smaller 5 kilowatt rooftop solar systems with consistent inverter configurations that backfed a breaker, that's relatively straightforward. That's not what we're seeing in this new era that we're in. We're seeing, especially in your area, PG&E territory has a lot of old electric services. Sometimes they're relatively small, 100 amp, 125 amp. They've got old panel boards. Sometimes they're hot bus panel boards. And you've got to look at what's inside under the dead front cover to even figure out how you're going to be able to adapt. Sometimes we have to relocate all the loads to a new panel board. So understanding the technology is critical, but there are some understandable technical complexities and some unfortunate self-imposed technical complexities in the realm of code standards interpretation from jurisdictions and utilities that add to the cost that I think we can resolve through work that KELSA is doing, the work SIA is doing, the work that industry organizations are doing to bring clarity to code standards and permitting.
How are products and services like Solar App and Symbian that are there to really streamline the building department to AHJ permitting? What do you think of those?
Well, these automated permit application systems like Symbian and Solar App, and then there are some other custom programs like LA City has their own in-house developed system. I think that standardized interconnection application has benefits. It has certain inherent challenges also. For example, for Solar App, you have to have the contractors approved to be able to use it, and there is a time to get that approval. And then the questions, because we do fill out solar applications for our customers also where they're applicable. It's kind of interesting because we do the plan set, which has its own set of rules. We do interconnection application with the utility, which has its own set of rules. And then Solar App has its own way of looking at that, where you have to know the right answers to the questions that sometimes aren't as clear as we'd like. Now, we've been very involved with certain challenges we've seen with Solar App to help them sort those out. So I do think that that's part of the solution. It's not the ultimate solution, because the reality is that there are certain projects that fall outside the scope of what Solar App or Symbian can handle. And there are, I think, again, just automated permit processing has been around for a long time with certain jurisdictions, but not everything can fit cleanly into that category.
Yeah. You kind of hit the nail on the head, and it's really good to hear that Planet Plansets will help out with filling out Solar App and Symbian and even interconnection stuff. Our tactics between now and the end of the year, it's this is in July, we're going to really crank as much as we can through the end of the year. But some jurisdictions don't use Solar App or Symbian or don't have automated permitting, and they can take 2 or 3 months. I mean, literally 2 months to get a permit done. Then we've got to order the equipment and do the installation. So we're getting to the point right now, and it's summer 2025, but very, very soon, we're basically going to say, unless your jurisdiction, unless your city uses Solar App or Symbian or has automated permitting like San Jose, we can't get the job done by the end of the year. And it's just a strict timing thing. Now, the other thing that I've learned as a contractor for so many years is our total cost for getting an installation done. The most important thing is the speed at which we can execute. And every time we have to put things aside and get some information for a permitting authority or get the special piece of equipment or figure out how to wire into this unusual panel, that really slows us down. So the cookie cutter systems, the ones that fit into the Solar App, Symbian, San Jose realm, they allow us to be faster and cheaper. And really, fast is the key word now, looking at the end of the tax credit.
Well, and you mentioned something earlier in our discussion before we started that I feel is beneficial to clarify, and that is, as I understand the OBBBA, as it's acronymized, one big, I'm not going to call it beautiful. I have a different B word that starts with B and ends with an S. Well, it ends with a T, actually, but the acronym is BS. So the OBBBA does not require that you have PTO by December 31st. It technically, interestingly, doesn't require that you have the sign off by the inspector. But what it does require is that you've paid the money. And in California, you can't pay the money legally until you have the inspection card signed off. Is that correct, Barry?
In California, the rule is, and this is a California contractor state licensing law, is you can only bill and collect money from the customer to the extent that you've actually done the work. So you've got to really make sure that once it's all done, then they can pay everything. Typically what we do is, we get 8% of the money when we deliver the equipment and start the installation. And then when the final building inspection is done, which basically means it's done. There's nothing else we can do. Yes, we have to go through some utility machinations, but once that building sign-off is done, that's when we always consider the system completed, and that's when we collect the rest of the money. There's also interpretations of the bill that when you look at it carefully, the system has to be installed and capable of producing the electricity that it's designed for. So when we're finished with the installation, our crews commission the system, they turn it on, they test it, they run through a blackout sequence, and so it's all working. Then we have to basically wait, turn it off until the inspector comes, and then usually keep it off until the utility gets there, depending on the design.
I had to wait 3 months from the time my system was installed, tested, and operational before the utility gave me permission to operate. And that was kind of agonizing because my system back in 2013 got installed in May when we were getting these wonderful, cool, long days where your kilowatt hour production would be fantastic. And then I had to wait till August, which is, it was agonizing to say the least. We also had to do a main service panel upgrade. So it was kind of a frustration, but that said, Barry, it sounds like the example you used for your customers, you would have to wait till you have the signed off inspection card. That has to be done by December 31st in order for you to for the work to be done and for that customer to get access to the 30% tax credit. Is that correct?
We are basically going to be relying on the customer's accountant to tell us exactly how they want to do it. So some accountants will say, I want to make sure the building inspection is done. Some accountants are going to say, I want to make sure that it's connected and capable of generating electricity. For commercial systems, sometimes the rule is that they want to make sure the interconnection is there. A little known fact, just coming back to your example when you had your system done in May and it took another 3 months. Utilities used to get really pissy and huffy and legal on you if you were running your meter backwards without their interconnection approval. And there's 3 reasons why that could happen. 1, you put in solar and you didn't tell them, so during the day you're generating a credit. They don't like that. They lose money. 2, you took your meter off and flipped it over and now are running it backwards illegally. People have been known to do that. Or 3, the meter's defective and it's making a mistake. Now, I remember going back 25 years, the utilities would send nasty legal letters saying, you can't do that. They don't do that anymore. All around the country, the policy seems to be that if your meter is running backwards and you don't have an interconnection agreement, or the meter could be broken, or you turned it upside down, all they're going to do is as those kilowatt hours go back and would theoretically reduce your bill, they charge you the full retail rate for that money. So we've had, and I've seen this happen, first happened with my cousin in New Jersey. He said, Barry, my bill went up the month after you installed the system. And then we kind of looked and I said, oh, it was on, and they must have been charging you for excess electricity. So we've seen that happen again and again. Happens all over. People leave it on. And between you and me and anybody else that's listening, if you do that during the summer, you're probably going to get busted. But if you do that during the winter, when your meter may never be running backwards, it's cloudy, whatever, it's not going to matter. But we always advise, we always leave the system off and we wait for that interconnection, and we get a nice email from PG&E, and then they can turn the system on and it goes from there.
Yeah, and I'll just mention that there is an even darker side to that scenario where if you do inappropriately turn on your system before you have official permission to operate from the utility, in your utility service agreement, buried in the fine print, it states if you don't do things the way we want, we can turn service off to your property. So they've got a lot of power over your ability to get electricity through their grid. And I think that everybody should recognize that utilities, unfortunately, don't play nice in most cases, and they don't have very effective oversight. So when they establish unique rules and requirements, the best we can normally do is understand those and figure out how to work within the framework of that. It's not to say we can't challenge those, but as you've seen from your years' involvement in CALSA, and certainly it's been my exposure since I joined the board in 2014, holy moly, the utilities have just almost free reign to do what they want, how they want. And then if they do something inappropriate, there's little to no repercussion they face. So the thing I would advise any contractor be conscientious of is, as much as we may be frustrated with utility policies, try to work professionally within the framework of those policies for the good of your business.
We always try and be nice. We're going through a commercial interconnection right now where we put in all the details of the equipment numbers that were specified by the manufacturer and the distributor, and then the utility bounces it back because they've got a couple of suffixes on a couple of product numbers that we didn't use, and there's another 2 or 3 week delay. All right, there's so many things that we can talk about here. I want to shift gears a little bit. We talked about this earlier. I wanted to just raise it because you have some good perspectives, but how do you see the leasing and the PPA business growing or happening in 2026? And what does that mean for homeowners, and how viable do you think that's going to be? Because that's probably 70% of the business right now in the country.
Well, it's interesting. According to Roth Capital yesterday, they said based on this, the recent past, that for residential only, third-party ownership was 45% of the market. The remainder, 55%, was loans and cash. Which means roughly, let's say, half TP third-party ownership and half owned systems. I've been doing my best. I'm not a financial wizard, but what I'd say is I'm good at math. And, engineers, have to take a lot of math in college, so we're good at math. And when I've run the numbers, we'll start out this way. Section 25D, systems that were purchased with cash or loans, the presumption is we're going to see a notable decline in half the residential market, a notable decline. The other half that's third-party owned, I've seen projections from some of these folks that are in that industry that they might see business go up. I've seen, question marks, I guess you could say, about TPO, third-party ownership in general, leases and PPAs. What I'll say is that the federal government is, right as we speak, trying to redefine these terms such as start construction and the foreign entities of concern. So essentially, there's a whole new set of rules and timelines and requirements to be eligible to get tax credits in the 48E commercial tax credit for solar. And I think that the question for leasing companies probably is, how might start construction be redefined? It has been perceived to be 5% of the overall project sell price. You have to essentially safe harbor by spending money now before the rules change, right? But that could, within the next several weeks, be redefined to make it 20 or 25% of the final contract price that you'd have to spend today to be eligible to get those tax credits years down the road. So that's one area of complexity that everybody is keeping a close eye on, myself included. And then you've got some other interesting things. Energy storage systems have eligibility for 30% tax credit for commercial systems, including residential lease systems, up through 2035, if I'm not mistaken, through the end of 2035. However, there's strings attached. To get access to the 30% tax credit for a energy storage system, you would have to comply with these foreign entity considerations, which basically means how much of the content of that battery and inverter and your overall project is going to Chinese lithium in the batteries or Chinese circuit boards in the inverter, or possibly a unknown Chinese owner of the company you buy the equipment through that's getting part of that profit. That's where the trickiness comes into play. So I think that what we are looking at for third-party owned systems, or commercial solar for that matter, is what will these rules look like in a few weeks. 45 days from last Monday, the White House issued a requirement that the Department of Treasury redefine start of construction and clarify the foreign entities of concern language. So we are waiting with bated breath as to what that determination might be, to understand how it will affect our commercial business, and how, less of a concern for us is how it might affect the third-party owned residential sector. So if we see that safe harbor requirement of 5% raised to 20 or 25%, it's going to be harder for residential leasing companies to spend the money now that they would need to for projects that they hope to do 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
And I totally agree. And I just, kind of watched how this thing evolved. And Chip Roy was not in favor of signing the OBBB because he basically, as did Trump, has it against solar and wind. And he basically said, well, I'll sign it, but you got to find a way to make sure that those tax credits for solar, even if it's under 48E, don't go through. So I'm not expecting a light touch on the increase in those foreign entity of concerns rules, safe harbor rules, and commence construction. It's going to be worse, but we'll kind of see how it works out. It's really going to be challenging.
And Barry, I'll ask this question. And last week, Brad Hevner at Kelsa had a wonderful, informative webinar on this subject. But how are people going to know what percentage of that battery or what percentage of that inverter comes from China? Or how do you even figure that out?
Yeah, and then I agree. And then here's the other thing that's happening. And you got to think about it, because we saw the same thing happening with the tax credit when roofers were saying, I'm going to include the roof as part of the solar. So it used to be the old days you had a battery and you had a solar inverter. Now the solar and battery inverter are in one box from Tesla, from Enphase, from Franklin. So how are the TPO companies going to be allocating the cost of the whole solar and battery system when a lot of the equipment is for the battery? And then you say, well, what's left with the solar? It just may be putting 20 solar panels on the roof, some racking, and running some conduit. All the customer acquisition cost, all the deployment cost, the permitting cost, almost everything else can be attributed to the battery system, which has that tax credit through 48E. So it'll be interesting to see how or if there are any guidelines or rules on how you split that combined system, because 90% of the systems are going to go in together.
And it just makes you wonder if you say, oh, okay, I've got a DC coupled solar and storage box. So the battery's in there, the inverter's in there. I plug my solar panels into that. But, let's say you could get solar panels from a country that's not got Chinese ownership of that product. Let's say you can get your racking system from non-Chinese sources, and that contributes to the overall project price. And does the FIAC rules relate to the overall project price, or do you have to filter out the solar portion of it and then apply it to the remainder? These are things I don't think have a clear understanding of, and we'll be trying to better understand that here in the coming week.
I hope whoever's kind of making up those rules don't listen to this podcast, because we don't want them to be setting rules that are going to be too onerous for within our
I'm pretty
industry.
sure they aren't listening, Barry.
Oh, come on. I mean, I'm sure it's no, just kidding. I agree.
The people in our industry will be listening, but what I'll say is that in my years working with Kelsa, which was my first real significant exposure in the arena of policy, legislation, regulatory aspects of work we do, it's really challenging to get these policymakers to understand what we're talking about here today. I would love if they'd listen to this, because if they listen to it, what I'd say to them is, hey folks, we're still the most cost-effective way to get electricity to the grid, and you need us really badly, so don't dismiss our concerns. Unfortunately, we've been trying to communicate that message to these legislators and policymakers, and the reality is I don't think they can absorb it. They probably have too many other people to listen to. So my hope is that the folks that will be here a year or 2 years from now realize the significant importance that policy plays in our ability to operate as a business, and supports those initiatives through things like Kelsa membership. Plain and simple, Kelsa is your best friend in California solar. And even if you aren't a Kelsa member, you're benefiting tremendously from the hard work that Kelsa is doing. So I would encourage every solar contractor in the state of California to join Kelsa. Not only will you be supporting an initiative that'll keep your business viable, but the informational resources that are there helps you wade through this mess. I'm contributing regularly to those informational resources so that contractors, when they say, we've got a building department that's asking about this for code compliance or a standard, or they have this new rule, oftentimes Kelsa has addressed that in informational resources that might allow you to avoid the problem or resolve it once that problem occurs. So I do want to encourage people to be engaged in the policy activity, because the reality is we're in energy. Energy is a policy-driven business, plain and simple. And those contractors that are engaged and aware have a strategic advantage over contractors that are oblivious.
Yeah, and you look at what's happening in California, and a similar situation nationwide with regards to the OBBB bid. In California, without the efforts of Kelsa, just yesterday, AB 942, with the evil solar policy in AB 942, which basically said, if you sell your house, you no longer have net metering or grandfathering. That was gone. But before that, the policy was net metering is going to be eliminated. No grandfathering is zero. So everybody who put in the system before 2005, no more net metering, including almost everybody. So that's changing. So we talked a lot about coping strategies and things like that for people within the industry, for solar installers, for contractors, for people within the value chain. What should residential and commercial customers, people who are thinking about putting solar or batteries on their building, what should they be doing right now?
Well, if they fall into that cleanly into that box you described earlier, where they have a fairly straightforward installation where the equipment isn't too elaborate and they can apply quickly through Solar app to get the system done, they should probably find a competent solar contractor and get locked in today, because you're probably not going to be able to do that another month from now. If you're not in a position to make that investment here in this year, just realize that next year solar and storage will still be the cheapest kilowatt hours you can buy. Even though they'll be more expensive, they'll still be cheaper than the grid, assuming that you hold on to the ownership of your system long term. So the thing that I would say to any homeowner, whether they're getting a system this year or next or the following, is realize that this is an investment. And this is an investment. In order for you to achieve the investment, you have to make certain that that system is going to perform the way you want it to over the long term. So what we find oftentimes is people that look for the lowest cost of install are often sadly disappointed with the overall results of that. So don't underestimate the importance of value. And when you're talking to these contractors, try to understand how long have they been in business? Do they have credentials? Are they NABCEP certified? To me, that is one of those marks of excellence that you want to verify. It's not to say that everybody who's NABCEP certified is equally competent, but it's a really good filter. Are they a member of the California Solar and Storage Association? If they are, they're probably more dedicated to this industry and likely to be around to service that system 3 or 4 years from now. And don't underestimate the relationship that you as the end customer now has with the company that makes that battery or that inverter, because these are software, firmware dependent systems where you have a long-term relationship with the manufacturer to make certain that they're keeping that firmware and software properly adjusted, tweaked, so that it's maybe even things like the utility rate structures are changing. You might have to have new profiles that have to be uploaded to your inverter so you can adjust your time of use hours, for example, would be a great one. So you've got, as a homeowner, the long-term relationship that you're going to have with that equipment manufacturer and ideally the installer. So be selective to choose the right partner to do the install, to choose the right equipment. And I realize you can never guarantee anything in this world, but one thing I'll say is I have my top tier of recommended solar and battery systems that I know of. And there's a handful of companies in that top tier that I will say have proven themselves to be legitimate and really try to make certain that the customer is going to be well taken care of. Then you've got this range of newer products that have come on the market that are sometimes unknown. Some of them may make it into my top tier, and many of them fall by the wayside within a year or two. Just realize that your user experience is going to be a function of that long-term relationship that will be established over 5 to 10 years with that solar and battery system. And if you stick with one of the top companies that I work with regularly, I'm confident that you'll be better off than if you choose a random newcomer.
Yeah, really, really good insights, really, really good advice. We're almost at the end here. Just kind of talk a little bit more about Planet Plansets. And Jeff, how did you get into the solar industry?
When I was in college in the 80s, I worked as a telemarketer selling the StarPack solar energy system to people as they were eating dinner. And my selling line was, how would you like to save money on your energy bill? And if they said no, my response was, you don't want to save money on your energy bill? So that was my first foray into the world of solar.
Hold on. Can I just make a suggestion for you? This is just a personal bit of a recommendation advice. I always check people's LinkedIn profiles to see when they got in the solar industry, and you should add that in. That is really a great anecdote.
Well, I guess I will. For many years, I was embarrassed to say that because I was both a telemarketer and working in solar water heating, which at that time didn't have a great reputation because there were a lot of companies that came from nowhere and started selling products, went out of business, and their customers didn't get good value. That's why I'm encouraging people to prioritize seeking value rather than seeking a low price. That said, but after I graduated college, I was from Michigan. I did not know photovoltaics existed. I had some vague concept, if you will, that solar panels were used in satellites to generate power, but I had no awareness whatsoever in the 1980s that solar panels at that time were being used to power people's homes. And that was going on in Humboldt County and Mendocino County and Grass Valley and a few other, places around the country where people were off grid. And then I worked in the industrial automation field for a number of years In the early 2000s, not being particularly entranced by the career path that I had chosen, I was recommended by a friend of mine to get a book called What Color is Your Parachute?
I remember that book.
And the basic principle is, it was for folks that were not satisfied with their career and always wanted to bail out. And they complained to this fellow who wrote the book, about their problems and how they wanted to bail out. And his response to them is, oh yeah, what color is your parachute? You want to bail out. Have you planned for this? Have you thought about where you're going to go? And what it forced you to do is an exercise where you identify what you're good at and what you're not good at. And that's a little bit difficult for most people to do. And what you like to do and what you don't like to do. What you try to do is align those things that you're good at with what you like to do. And when I went through these exercises, what I came up with is I really enjoy educating smart people on technical subjects, and energy, especially solar, was high on the list. So I had been working in the industrial automation field. I had lost my job and was on the cusp of getting a job again in the industrial automation industry. And that fell through at the 11th hour. And I was really frustrated. My wife had said to me something she had said many times previous. She says, well, what about solar energy? Because she knew I was interested in it. And I said, I'm really interested, but I don't know if I can make a living at it. And this is in the early 2000s. And she said, why don't you, or mid 2000s, I guess, she said, why don't you go to a trade show and learn a little bit about it and see if it might work? And so I attended, like many people who started to come to the industry at that era, the Solar Power 2006 trade show in San Jose, your neck of the woods. And that was when Arnold Schwarzenegger was expanding the California Solar Initiative to, a broader range of homeowners. And that's when the Million Solar Roof program was born. And I walked around the show and I loved it. I was just like, this is all for me. It was like, it turned me on in a major way. And I ran across the booth of one of the major distributors at the time, AEE Solar, which is one of the pioneering companies, alternative energy engineering, started by David Katz. And I connected with him really, like, right out the gate. I was like, boy, I like this company. And it took me 6 months. I went through my solar training with Solar Energy International. And I told AEE Solar that was interested in talking to me about a job, hey, I'd like to work for you, but I don't feel responsible until I've gotten the minimum requisite education to make certain I know technically what the heck I'm talking about. So after I finished the beginning and advanced PV classes with Solar Energy International, started working for AEE Solar. They were based at that time in Redway, California, Humboldt, and it launched my solar career and also opened my eyes to the amazing stories of how this technology was brought down from space into homes around the world, which is why I've been part of this team of people making this documentary film, Solar Roots, the Pioneers of PV, that tells the story, the true story of the birth of the solar industry.
That's a great movie. I'm just cracking up about What Color is Your Parachute, because I had that book in the early 80s. I remember it was a thick paperback, and I went through all the exercises. And this is when I was in the solar business. I was doing solar thermal research. I lost my job because the company ran out of money. This was in Boston. And I was just striving. I did some heat pump work. I did energy efficiency. And I just went through that book, and I just couldn't find a job in anything that I really liked. So I just said, screw it. I'm going to go to business school. And I just took a 15-year detour, and I got back into it in the early 2001 when the Enron crisis hit and rates started going through the roof, and there were good incentives in California, so it worked. All right, so back to Jeff over here. What do you do for fun?
My answer to that is solar. I love this technology. I do. I guess the more serious answer is I'm a gardener. I just I putter around the garden and work in the yard, and I have been more focused on, my health and physical activity and working out. But I live a very quiet, boring lifestyle, and most of it's consumed with my focus on helping this technology, this industry advance. Because when I decided to get back into the solar industry in the mid 2000s, the goal I had at that time, and it still remains my goal, is I want to make solar and renewables the leading form of electrical power generation. So we have a long way to go to get there. And a lot of the volunteer work I do with NABCEP, with CALSA, in the codes and standards realm, a lot of it's not compensated work, but it's satisfying my desire to make a contribution to the future generations by making renewable energy the way that people get electricity rather than having to burn fossil fuels, which we know are damaging. I used to work in the oil industry, by the way, and I've seen the devastation that occurs both locally and in a massive area. I've flown over the tar sands in Fort McMurray, Alberta, as part of my previous career, and it's not pretty. And I can say without hesitation that renewables are absolutely less expensive in every possible way, especially when you factor in the environmental impact. So I'm going to continue to my dying breath to do what I can to make a contribution to make solar the leading form of electrical power generation for mankind.
Spoken like a true solar pioneer. Terrific to have you here. How can people get in touch with you at Planet Plansets? Let's just repeat the URL and any phone number that you may have.
Yeah, so planetplansets.com. I suspect if you were to Google Planet Plansets, we should be the first hit. I'm kind of curious to see if we are. Maybe not. We don't tend to advertise, Barry. I guess what we'd say is that all the work that we've done to build credibility over the years, I feel, is the word of mouth advertising that's probably the most effective. But that said, we appreciate all of our existing customers, all the referrals we get from our colleagues in the industry. Certainly appreciate you allowing us to plug our business here, and just know that we care and we're going to be here. I'm not going away. I will be doing this work if I'm mentally capable in 20 years, because I care about this industry. I care about the customers. I care about the end customers. I want to make certain that we bring tremendous value to all levels of the industry.
Definition of a solar pioneer here and going into the future way in advance. All right. Thanks, Jeff, for joining me on the show, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you missed any of today's show, you can go to our website at www.energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.
This episode of The Energy Show was proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.